My name's Kim and I'm an advocate. Ted is an 89-year-old man with learning disabilities living in a supported living environment with two housemates who are both in their 40s. Ted's lived in institutions from a very young age. He originally lived on a hospital campus site until he moved into his current accommodation about 18 years ago. His health is generally good, although his eyesight is starting to fail. And because of Ted's age, the lines between his learning disability needs and elderly needs are now blurring. The only family member that Ted had contact with was an older sister, Lillian, who lived about 20 miles away from him and visited him from time to time. When she died about 9 years ago, staff wouldn't let Ted go to the funeral because they said it might upset him. Following this, I received a referral for independent support for Ted because staff had noticed there was a deterioration in his mental and emotional well-being. I visited Ted and it was clear that his family, or what he knew of it, had been a very important part of his life, and the loss of his sister had clearly affected this. It was particularly difficult because he hadn't been allowed to say goodbye and grieve for her. He also saw his housemates being visited quite regularly by their parents, siblings, nephews, nieces, and receiving gifts and cards at birthdays and Christmas, and this impacted even more on his life because he had no such input. I suggested to staff that the answer might be to try and contact further members of Ted's family so that he could have regular contact with them. Staff said that they didn't have details of any more members of the family and therefore that wasn't something that they would be able to do, and Ted just needed support to cope with the loss of his sister and move on with his life. I didn't think that was a very satisfactory thing for Ted, and after a lot of discussion with him it was clear that what he would want was to establish contact with family members. I found that his sister had lived in a nursing home towards the end of his life, so I wrote to the nursing home. I knew that they wouldn't release any details to me, but I asked them if I sent them a sealed letter with a stamp on, addressed to other members of the family, whether they would be willing to forward that on, and they said yes, they'd be willing to do that, and so that's the action that I took as Ted's advocate. I sent the letter explaining the situation and confirming that Ted wasn't asking for any practical or financial support because I thought that the family might wonder if that was the situation from this sudden and unexplained contact. I said he just wanted family contact and that he'd like to receive cards at Christmas and at birthdays, and at that stage I thought that would be sufficient to meet his needs. Within a week of sending that letter, I received a phone call. The phone call was from Ted's niece, Barbara. Barbara was Lillian's daughter. I talked to her about Ted and his life. She'd heard her mother mention Ted, but she didn't have any real knowledge about him, and so she was very interested to hear about him and agreed to establish contact with him. I also found out that Barbara's got a sister called Pat, and she was also willing to make contact with Ted. 9 years later, Ted has regular contact with both his nieces. Between them, they have 4 children and 7 grandchildren, 4 of whom have been born in the last 9 years while Ted's been in contact with the family. Ted has a very clear understanding of the family tree of relationships, and he refers to himself as the great-granduncle of the children in the family, which is really nice. Christmas and birthday cards and presents are exchanged, and as the babies have been born, I've gone to shopping with Ted and he's bought gifts to send for the new babies. Pat, one of his nieces who lives quite close, comes to see him in the summer and at Christmas, and he really looks forward to those visits. It's a massively important part of Ted's life. It's going to be his 90th birthday later this year, and we're hoping that more of the family will be able to come and visit him then. Barbara and Pat have sent Ted lots and lots of family photos, both of their children and grandchildren, but more importantly, of their grandparents and of Ted's brothers and sisters, many of whom he never knew because he'd been institutionalised. And from that, we've been able to build up photo albums, giving him a picture of his family. And again, that's something that's really important to him. And he spends quite a lot of time with staff looking at those albums and talking about his relatives and his family. I usually, as his advocate, spend some time with him at Christmas and Easter, and we make cards together, usually with photographs of him on, and we send them to his family. And I know that they're as important to his family as the ones that Ted receives are to him. Apart from Pat, most of the family live about 200 miles away, so he hasn't had very much actual face-to-face contact with them. But one of Pat's daughters has recently had a baby, and she's arranged to come up and see her mum over the summer, and she's going to bring the baby with her, and they're going to visit Ted, and that will mean that he's meeting even more of his family, which will be fantastic for him and will make a real difference to him. I've also supported Ted to make a will, which has ensured that he can leave whatever assets he has when he dies to the people who matter most to him. As an advocate, I think the important thing to me is that Ted has found his family, and for them, well, they've found part of their history.